All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to moderate this panel of industry providers in this Open RAN ecosystem. So if we could kick things off, well, Ian, you've been added. So if we real quick just introduce yourself and let the group know what company you're from, although.
Sure. Thank you. And Ganesh Shenbagaraman from Radisys. I head the standardization function in addition to taking care of ecosystem partnerships and regulatory affairs. So get deeply involved in multiple ecosystem partnerships, jointly developing many products and solutions. And sometimes these are demonstrations of advanced capabilities, but many times it's a real serious product development roadmap activity. So most of the folks here in this conference, we have ended up working with them. Anyway, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ian Wong. I'm in the CTO office of Viavi Solutions. So Viavi, we are a test and measurement company, very focused on all things on the network side. I am leading the RF and wireless strategy for the company. Happen to also be the co-chair of the test integration focus group in the ORAN Alliance, and also the technical lead for Valor, which you'll hear about in the next panel, which is the lab that we won from NTIA. Yeah, thanks.
Hi everyone, I'm Paul Sutton. I'm with Software Radio Systems. We're the team behind the SRS RAN project, and we're full stack vendors of RAN solutions for 4G and 5G.
And Phil DiGuglielmo, I just introduced myself, I guess, a director at Jabil. I deal with a lot of trying to establish partnerships, and I also handle software development there as well. And Jabil, as I said, is a big manufacturing company.
All right. Well, Phil, to kick us off, I'm going to queue up the first question for you, if that's okay. So wanted you to expand a little bit more on why Jabil is specifically supportive and interested in Open RAN and helping to facilitate the push towards open and interoperable.
So we think, so at Jabil, I mean, I think it's becoming clear that the industry is certainly moving more towards this open standard, open source to some degree, but certainly open standards for innovation purposes, right? And more players can get in the market. And since more players can get in the market, Jabil is very interested in expanding. You know, we've done a lot of this, made a lot of systems and, RAN systems which are monolithic. We want to expand now because we see the market moving. We're going to try to move with it, so to keep our manufacturing business going, basically.
That's great. So this is a question I'm going to ask each of you. What do you see as some of the myths about open source and Open RAN, and how do you think your company or you specifically can go about debunking that? So a lot of things, we hear frequently from my side of the fence is performance parity, and it's not as reliable. But are there additional things that I might not have captured there? So Ganesh, if you want to take the first shot.
So almost 5 years ago, we were in the same place, ONS Summit 2019. That's when the ORAN open source initiative was announced. I was here. And of course, there was a lot of questions, skepticism at that time, whether this is really an initiative that will go forward or it will end up being just a big announcement, right? And 5 years down the line, we have seen open source being developed under ORAN open source community. And now there is a big announcement about Open Air interface announcing this Linux Foundation MOU. So there is a certain level of activity and vibrancy in this community around open source. Scaling this open source implementation and reaching the performance level, it's going to take more effort, obviously, especially on the challenging elements of the CU and DU and so on, and of course some of the reconnect apps. But in the background of all these things is there was a general disbelief and skepticism about Open RAN itself. It took almost 2 years for many of the vendors and some of the operators to get convinced that Open RAN is not a science experiment. And the first major milestone which was achieved, and the signals that were coming out from the industry broadly, both from a telco point of view and vendors, is that the broad acceptance and products coming out with open front-all compliance has Alex Choi rightly pointed out. That was the real achievement and started turning around the industry around the Open RAN, the viability and success of the Open RAN, and the performance aspects have been proven over the last 2-3 years several times over for many of these things, many of the configurations. Now the last barrier, as pointed out in the earlier session, is achieving the same level of performance with a massive MIMO system. Once that is achieved, the uplink performance initiative, performance improvement feature which is being defined, closed in Open RAN standards, ORAN standards, if that is implemented and proven, I think the remaining skeptics will also be turning around. I think there will be a broad acceptance of the larger principle that open solutions can be as performant and equivalent to the closed traditional RAN vendors systems as well.
So myths on open source, I think there's the concept that open source is developed by a bunch of nerdy, pale-skinned kids in their basement contributing code out of altruism. I think the reality is majority of open source developers are in the largest companies in the world, developing production code that is running millions of data centers and relied upon by billions of consumers. So I think that's one myth that still I think is pervasive. That it's and again it can get there for RAN. We're not there yet today, to be honest. I think the second myth that I would throw out there is the reason that vendors are doing this is for cost reasons. And I heard this yesterday. I think it was enlightening. That really it's about disruption, right? The reason the biggest vendors in the world would invest their own precious software engineers to contribute to open source is disruption. So I think obviously Open RAN is one of the biggest disruptions for our telecoms industry. So I think I would encourage really a lot of vendors in this room to think about, it's not just about cost. I mean, think about the cost savings you can get if, let's say, you remove the core aspects that are non-differentiating and move it to open source, first of all. But also, by doing that, you enable this disruption that you so want to see. So.
Okay, so myths around open source, Open RAN. I think the first one is bugbear of mine, is that the CU and DU is comparable in complexity to the other elements of the Open RAN architecture. I think this is fairly obviously not the case. And if you look at efforts to build an end-to-end open source Open RAN system, if you look at the ORNSC, if you look at the 5G Super Blueprint, I think there's a big hole where the CU and DU need to be. I think everybody's recognized that today. The reason is that those are really, really complex and really, really hard and really, really valuable, frankly. So that's the first myth. Then I think around the ability of open source Open RAN to be as performant as commercial solutions. So I think we're demonstrating that open source can be deployed in production with some of the networks that we've deployed and with some of the solutions that we're putting out there. What I would say is that it comes down to having a dependent consumer, and I've said this multiple times and I'll reinforce the point. You need to have somebody that is building a production network and is depending on that software because they're going to drive the performance and the sustainability of the project. And I think getting to the point, so the place where open source really comes into its own is where it's a really innovative, new, disruptive space. And so that's the starting point. And that's what we're seeing is if you're in air to ground, if you're in low Earth orbit satellite networks, something you take off the shelf isn't going to work in that environment. And so if you have a really flexible platform that you can tailor to that specific niche, then you have a competitive edge and it makes more sense for somebody to depend on your software as the consumer. And that's the starting point, but I think that grows. So if you ask me, can we go head to head with tier one vendors today on RAN? No, of course we can't. We're not spending billions in R&D. But ask me, can you provide a platform for a neutral host small cell? Yes, absolutely we can do that. And that's a starting point. So you build a platform that somebody like a neutral host, small cell provider is putting out into the marketplace, and you build a maturity for that. And then suddenly you've got a platform that's a step closer to the bigger players. And so for me, that's the pathway I see in this.
I agree with both Ian and Paul for sure. But another myth, I think, of ORAN is that it's not ready. I think if you look at, so dish deployed stuff in the marketplace here, but also, we're talking to Vodafone. Vodafone has their RFP out now, and with the intention of within the next 2 or 3 years of building out a very significant amount of ORAN. So we know it's ready, we know things are happening, but there needs to be, I think, to really make sure that it's carrier grade, meeting those KPIs, meeting the security and the performance aspects. You need things like field trials. I don't know if it's going to be a funding of the field trials or whatever, but you need to prove to the industry as a whole that you have carrier grade equipment.
So sort of continuing to pull on the thread of open source and building a sustainable community of players that are contributing to that open source code, software base, recognizing it's going to need to be continually updated and maintained. What do you see as the key resources or ingredients or components that need to be able to come together to allow that open source ecosystem to flourish? Paul, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, really good question. I'll go back to kind of the points I made in my talk. For me, there are 4 key ingredients for, and this is more from the technical side than from the ecosystem side, but I'll reiterate them again. Open, performant, complete, and deployed. So OSI license, accessible code that people can actually read and modify and change themselves. Complete, not tied to a specific hardware platform. So not a chip vendor solution that will only run on their chip. And scalable. From small to large architectures, you need to be able to cover the full range. Performant, yeah, we've spoken about that, and deployed, again, I've emphasized that. But the biggest factor that I've seen and that I've experienced is that dependent consumer. Again, it's having a route to production. It's not just being a reference implementation, it's being a product platform. It's being something that people are building products and services on top of. Because as soon as you have that, you have the flywheel. So if you can get to that point, and certainly going head-to-head with tier 1 vendors is not the way to do that. But there are stepping stones to get there, and we're already on step 1, maybe step 2. And so once you have that growing investment, you have somebody that has a stake in the game. And if you look at all of the most successful open source projects, that's how they work. Google has a stake in the game for Kubernetes. That's how that started. They have a team of engineers working on it, and there's a flywheel right there cranking that. And so that's the way I see forward.
I would say, in addition to what Paul highlighted, the lab infrastructure to prove this all works and all the elements of continuous build, continuous testing, all these become an important element, and beyond a certain stage of development, you would like to see this code is working and nothing is breaking, because we're obviously building complex systems, right? And every line of change, every feature you add might break things, regression test suites, and continuously running these tests is becoming very important, and the lab infrastructure required is one key constraint today in some of the open source communities, and that's where we are seeing some difficulties. And again, from a design scaling point of view, adding to what Paul said, I think we need more experts to jump and show interest, contribute for these open systems to be much more scalable and to be on par in performance. I think this is growing nascent community still, so we need that firepower of those SMEs as well.
Thank you, Ganesh. I'll buy you a beer. That was what I was going to say. But I mean, obviously, lab, and I think, seriously though, I mean, not a surprise. You got to test things at scale, at performance, and it's the reason that we at Viavi, we actually investing ourselves, right? We're been active in the open source, open software community in OSC and ORAN for a few years. We actually contributed our equipment to get that up and running. We benefited as well because we were able to learn. You know, the RIC was built basically, you know, in OSC, and we learned, and we now have the market-leading RIC tester because we started working with OSC and invested there. And same with the open air interface. That's a recent one that we've gone in to be a strategic board member so that we can contribute our tools to really, again, make the RAN performant and scalable. So I absolutely thank you. Thanks for setting that up.
I want to quickly acknowledge their support as well, because in one of the labs, we've been constantly troubleshooting. It's hard to do everything remotely, teams from different geographies, but the level of attention being given, seriousness being given, and some of the troubleshooting calls, I've sat in those calls, and it's a great team effort, collaborative effort. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it's something we're putting a huge amount of effort into, and we're seeing the real value of. And it comes back to those stepping stones. So for us as a company, 2 years ago, we couldn't afford test equipment, so we wrote our own. And we were testing our own solutions, and that was enough to get us to step one. Last year, we bought TM500 and Terra VM Core, and now that's our in-house testing equipment end-to-end for the system. And it's brilliant to see the Valor Lab coming to fruition to take that further again and to get access to more test tools. And frankly, to avoid that huge step that we had to take of investing yourself in your own test equipment, because, yeah, that's a big step.
I do think ORAN is going to require a lot more cooperation between companies than we probably have ever seen, for one. So that's a key ingredient. Clearly defined standards is another one, right? So there's a lot of room for interpretation sometimes in standards. I compare ORAN with 3GPP. 3GPP is much more solid. It's probably years advanced, but ORAN, there's still questions and people implement different things. And then it goes back to your MVP, right? You need this test criteria, the labs, but you need the test criteria to prove that carrier grade performance.
So sort of continuing on that and how industry collaborates, do you, from your perspective, do you think there needs to be a license or some sort of industry agreed upon way to license this open source code to make it viable?
I'm going to let Paul answer that.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm evolving my thinking on this, frankly, because I've heard the term industry-friendly open source license, and I always used to hate it, because industry-friendly typically means there's no obligation to give back whatsoever, and that by definition is not sustainable. And so that I struggled with that, and that's why we have our business model at the moment, is because we dual license, and so there's a very definite sustainability element to that. And so that's where I'm coming from. Where I'm evolving my thinking to is, okay, the flip side of that is if you can have a license that is acceptable and is going to drive the widest possible adoption of the software. If you can get to that point, then you can get to the point of what I was talking about dependent consumers. And so you've got people who are building products and services on top of the platform, and then that's a different flywheel. That will drive that project forward. And so what I'm spending a lot of time thinking about at the moment is how you transition from one to the other. And I think that's a key question for the open source community in general, because the second one, the flywheel, works really well for big companies. The first one that we're in now works really, really well for small companies. And it's how do you get from one to the other?
Yeah, I would like to add that this is a question many times many companies, and both contributing companies and companies who want to use open source, both struggle, right? And the dual licensing model is one good way of solving this problem. But again, in the true sense of open source, as it is in the context of Linux and Linux Foundation, I think there are licenses available, and I think there is a whole bunch of effort being spent within the ORAN open source community also to define appropriate license here. Probably I'm not the best person to talk about it, but there are others, like Doug is here in the room, Doug from Qualcomm. So there is a lot of work that has been done to make it consumable without complications. But having said that, the legal teams within the respective companies, they do raise a lot of questions, and it's not unique or only specific to RAN. I think it happens for many of the GPL and non-GPL licensed and permissive licenses too, right? And I think industry is moving ahead right now. I think there is a greater tolerance, and there are mechanisms to look at the licenses being used. And SBOM is an excellent initiative to show the components of your software. And as long as there are no complications, you can see clear tracking and audit trail of how you are consuming those components, and you let your end user also know. I don't see major legal complications coming by the way of licenses. But again, having said this, every organization has a process. There is some amount of legal hurdles you have to go through, or at least approvals you have to go through before you use it.
No. Okay. Phil, I've got a question for you, but I think all of you might want to take a stab at this. But considering your business model and you're embracing Open RAN, how do you see your company embracing that open source, Open RAN compliant software stack as you move forward?
So like I said, we're in manufacturing, and we're sort of in the radio design aspects of that in the ORAN community. But, you know, from our manufacturing business and even from the radio business, you know, things going Open RAN, open source, we believe that that's the direction that the industry is taking. So Jabil as a whole, from a manufacturing perspective, from a radio design perspective, is going to benefit from this. There's no doubt going forward. You know, I think if we don't do it, we're going to be in trouble sooner or later. One thing that, you know, going further and embracing, right? I think the three of us are partnering to do some work to integrate in an NIWIC lab actually coming up soon. So I think this is a good proof point of how this is going to all operate.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, at the end of the day, it's kind of aligned incentives, right? And I think Martin Weiss, Dr. Weiss, you know, very brilliantly said, like transactional costs, like, you know, trying to drive that down. We need to see aligned incentives. For us, we saw an aligned incentive to support open source. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, we support more entrants into the market. I mean, as a test and measurement vendor, it's kind of no-brainer, right? More sockets, more tools to sell, more Pauls to support, and Ganesh, and right? So yeah, I think to us, it's definitely fully aligned with our, again, incentive as a company. I think when you find that aligned incentive, you know, same as open source getting deployed, now you have aligned incentives, and that's what drives it forward. At the end of the day, you know, it is economics. So.
Yeah, I think for us, it's been the biggest impact has been being able to play the part of the CU/DU and having a huge variety of different RUs that you can integrate with. So previously, there were a very limited number of RUs that we could do integration with, and it was always a proprietary interface, and it was a very difficult integration effort. I'm not saying it's an easy integration effort now, but it's getting easier, and the variety is much greater. So it allows us to play a much bigger role in that ecosystem. So for us as a company, yeah, it's a huge benefit.
I just want to say, you know, I probably need quicker adoption, though, because, you know, economics, right? Economics is ruling this whole thing, and the more things aren't adopted and the more we don't achieve volumes, the less companies will be able to continue on. So I think that's a critical aspect, and we have to have proof that this actually is going to work.
So this is one wild card. So as we've talked through this, and I've watched this ecosystem, my thoughts of adoption happening sort of at a private network or a use case specific adoption of open architecture. What do you think is that first use case or that first adoption to be sort of the easiest first step? Is it logistics? Is it healthcare? Or is it all of those? And how do you see that being the Kickstarter to drive that product pull to keep building that open source code?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And from what I've seen, it's the wildcard application. It's the crazy ideas. It's the really unique use cases where a new solution can compete against more established, mature solutions that are targeting mainstream. And I mean, to see the DoD getting involved in this, that's DoD all over. It's unique requirements, specific technical needs that can be met by a really flexible, open solution. And so that for me is another stepping stone. You've got those requirements that you can meet that nobody else can meet as well, and then that drives forward the solution as a whole, and suddenly there's a broader range of use cases that you can tailor to.
Yeah, I agree. I think the DoD, if we can prove out in that use case that we can do this, I mean, that'll start to generate a lot more interest, I think.
Yeah, I would say in our experience, it is easier in smaller networks, whether it's private networks or defense or some specific special networks, right? And it's easier to convince your audience, and they are also not having too many concerns. Their concerns are rather different. There are no ready-made solutions available in the market meeting their needs. So it's easier to put in and build a open RAN-based solution there. And when we talk to the larger network, the consumers who operate the larger network, there are different concerns, brownfield scenarios and stuff like that. So moving over from legacy, in-drops and stuff like that. But I think the proof points are much easier, and the awareness may not be the same in some of these cases when you talk to private network stakeholders. They sometimes do not even seem to care whether it's open RAN, it's called open RAN or not, right? But they leave it to you to solve the problem, and which is a good problem to have anyway. So.
Yeah, I would digress a little bit and maybe disagree a little bit in the sense of private networks it's a catch-all. It's catch-all for anything other than the large MNOs, right, that are deploying these macros. And I think every private network is a bit bespoke, right? So obviously open source, those types of solutions are well suited for that. But there's also varying requirements, right? Think about, the industrial edge that we heard, and those are things, like the performance levels for reliable low latency. We're not there yet with Open RAN. So I think it's a different answer if you're talking about open source Open RAN versus just Open RAN itself. I mean, I would say we have Dish, right? Ravinder's here, who's deployed the nationwide network with Open RAN today, and Rakuten Mobile in Japan. So I mean, just Open RAN itself, with the open front haul, with the open interfaces, it's driven by the biggest operators in the world because their incentive is supplier diversity, leverage against incumbents, et cetera. And I would venture out to say that obviously if you have greenfield, it's much easier. Brownfield is much harder. But I think we need more of that larger scale deployments, right? Then that's really going to be take it to the next level.
Drive
as what you're
volumes,
saying.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're out of time, and I apologize, but I really appreciate your participation this afternoon on this panel. So I apologize if we don't have questions, but thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
for having me.
Thanks all.